On the 20th of October, 1496, in a small Flemish town near the city of Antwerp in the Low Countries, one of the most consequential events in history took place. A 16-year-old Spanish princess stepped off a ship, met a duke she had never seen before, and married him the same day. The ceremony was unremarkable by the standards of the age. Dynastic marriages happened constantly across Europe, sealed by candlelight in cold stone churches, witnessed by courtiers who had traveled too far and eaten too well. Nobody in that church could have known what they were watching. That princess was Joanna of Castile. The duke was Philip of Burgundy, a member of the Austrian House of Habsburg. And the union of those two families on that gray October afternoon would, within 30 years, produce a single ruler who controlled Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia, large portions of Italy, and a colonial empire stretching from the jungles of Mexico to the shores of the Philippines. Within a century, the family name on that marriage certificate would belong to the most powerful dynasty the world had ever seen. Here is the question that makes this story genuinely extraordinary. The Habsburgs did not conquer their way to that position. They were not military geniuses. They produced no ruler history has called great. They declared bankruptcy repeatedly. They lost wars constantly. So how did they do it? The answer is that they married their way to the top of the world. And then, having mastered that strategy for 4 centuries, they turned it inward. And that is where everything went irreversibly wrong. This is the 900-year story of the House of Habsburg. Around the year 1025, a minor West German lord named Radbot, Count of Klettgau, decided to build a castle. He chose a site in what is now the canton of Aargau in northern Switzerland, a region that was at the time considered a peripheral stretch of the wider Germanic world, far from the centers of imperial power, far from the courts and the chronicles where history was being made. He named the castle Habsburg. The precise etymology has never been fully resolved. The second half of the name, Burg, is a standard Germanic term for a fortified settlement, the same root found in the names of a dozen major European cities. The first half, Habs, is contested. It may refer to a hawk, alluding to the altitude of the site, or it may derive from a word for a river ford. Nobody is entirely certain. It is a fitting ambiguity for a family whose earliest history is similarly hazy. Surnames were not common in 11th century Europe. People began adopting them in the 12th and 13th centuries, drawing on patronymic lines, occupations, or the places they came from. Radbot's descendants, continuing to live at and around that Swiss castle, gradually took its name as their own. The House of Habsburg was born not from a battlefield or a throne room, but from a moderately sized stone structure, in a location so unremarkable that the family would eventually lose control of it entirely, as the Swiss Confederacy expanded and pushed them out. The castle still stands today. You can visit it. It costs roughly €10 to enter. For 2 centuries after Radbot, the Habsburgs were exactly what their origins suggested: regional lords of modest significance, accumulating small parcels of land through marriage agreements and local alliances, styling themselves as Counts of Habsburg by the mid-12th century, but nowhere near the first tier of European power. The formula they relied on, patient matrimonial diplomacy rather than military aggression, was already established as their preferred instrument. They simply had not yet found a marriage consequential enough to change everything. That began to change in 1273, when Rudolf von Habsburg was elected King of Germany, a title that served as a stepping stone toward the position of Holy Roman Emperor, the nominal overlord of the sprawling constellation of independent principalities that comprised the Germanic world. The German princes chose Rudolf partly because they believed he was a manageable candidate, a regional count with limited resources and no dangerous ambitions. They were wrong about that almost immediately. Rudolf used his new title to muscle his way into Austria, installing 2 of his sons as Dukes of Austria and Styria in 1282, and shifting the family's center of gravity permanently eastward, from a Swiss castle to the growing river town of Vienna. The Habsburgs had outgrown their name's origin. They would never go back. The University of Vienna was founded under Habsburg patronage in 1365. In 1452, Frederick III became the first member of the family to hold the full title of Holy Roman Emperor. He also elevated Austria's status from a duchy to an archduchy, a seemingly minor semantic distinction that carried enormous weight in the prestige-conscious world of medieval European politics. And then Frederick engineered something far more significant than any title. He arranged for his son Maximilian to marry Mary of Burgundy in 1477. The Duchy of Burgundy was, in the 15th century, a genuinely formidable power. Its rulers had expanded outward from their base in eastern France to absorb the 17 provinces of the Low Countries, a region encompassing what we now call Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and parts of northeastern France. This was among the wealthiest and most commercially sophisticated regions in Europe, but the Burgundian line was fragile. Duke Charles the Bold died at the Battle of Nancy in 1477 without a legitimate male heir, and succession law in the Burgundian lands barred female inheritance. Through Maximilian's marriage to Charles's daughter Mary, the entire Burgundian inheritance, including those 17 wealthy provinces, passed to the House of Habsburg without a single significant military campaign. The Habsburgs had not fought for it. Someone else had simply died, and they were standing in the right place because they had previously married the right person. It was a pattern that would define the next 2 centuries. The marriage of Joanna of Castile to Philip the Handsome in 1496, the event that opened this story, was that same pattern operating at its most spectacular scale. Philip died young in 1506, and Joanna was subsequently deemed unfit to rule, her grief after his death so consuming that her own family used it as justification to confine her and govern in her name. Their son Charles, born in 1500, inherited a domain of staggering scope before he was old enough to manage it himself. By 1516, he was King of Spain. By 1519, he was Holy Roman Emperor, ruling under the title Charles V. He also held the Low Countries, the Spanish territories in Italy, including Sicily and Sardinia, and a colonial enterprise in the Americas that was only beginning to reveal its full dimensions. Those dimensions were extraordinary. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico, and within 2 years had brought the Aztec Empire to its knees, delivering an entire civilization's wealth to the Spanish crown. In the 1530s, the Pizarro brothers dismantled the Inca Empire across South America. Between 1519 and 1522, an expedition initially commanded by Ferdinand Magellan completed the first circumnavigation of the globe under the Spanish flag. In 1543, a chain of islands in Southeast Asia was claimed for Spain and named after Charles's heir. The silver that flowed back across the Atlantic from the mines of Mexico and Bolivia in annual treasure fleets represented wealth so vast it caused global inflation to spike between 300% and 600% over the following century. Charles V was not simply the most powerful ruler in Europe. He was, in a meaningful sense, the first ruler of a genuinely global empire. He recognized, to his credit, that no single person could administer all of it effectively. In 1521, he transferred the Austrian lands to his brother Ferdinand, creating the 2 branches of the dynasty that would define European politics for the next 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. And then, as if the universe were cooperating with a family whose entire strategy depended on other dynasties conveniently expiring, the King of Hungary was killed fighting the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. Because of prior Habsburg marriage arrangements, his 3 crowns, Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia, passed immediately to Ferdinand. No conquest required. Another king died. The Habsburgs were, again, standing in exactly the right place. By the middle of the 16th century, the House of Habsburg ruled, at least nominally, over a domain larger than any since Rome. The marriage strategy had worked beyond any reasonable expectation, and it was precisely at this moment that the complications began to accumulate. Philip II, who inherited the Spanish throne from his father Charles V in 1556, ruled for 42 years and waged war almost without interruption for the entire period. He maintained standing armies exceeding 100,000 men across multiple theaters simultaneously, fighting the Protestant provinces of the Low Countries, the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, Protestant England in the Atlantic, and various Catholic and Protestant factions in France. The silver from the Americas was arriving in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to any earlier European monarch, and it was not enough. Philip declared state bankruptcy in 1557, again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596. 4 times the most financially endowed government on earth ran out of money. The expenditures were real. The results were not. The Dutch Revolt, which began formally in 1568, would not be suppressed in Philip's lifetime, or in the lifetime of any Habsburg who succeeded him. The Protestant northern provinces of the Low Countries simply refused to be governed by a Catholic Spanish king, and their refusal proved durable. By the 1590s, it was clear that not only would the Dutch Republic survive, it was entering a period of commercial and cultural prosperity that would make it one of the most influential small nations in European history. The Spanish Armada of 1588, 130 warships sent to break English naval resistance and enable an invasion, was scattered by weather and outmaneuvered by smaller, more maneuverable English vessels. England was, by any objective measurement, a significantly weaker power than Spain. The Habsburgs fought it to a stalemate anyway. The deeper problem was philosophical. Both Charles V and Philip II defined their reigns primarily by the effort to eliminate Protestantism from Europe. Martin Luther's challenge to Rome began in 1517, 2 years before Charles became emperor, and the Habsburgs spent the better part of a century treating it as their central strategic priority. They failed completely. Protestantism spread across northern Europe regardless of the soldiers and the silver and the decades of war. Your religious obsession was not merely a distraction from more productive governance. It was the engine of the fiscal ruin. The Austrian branch was simultaneously developing its own version of this problem. Ferdinand II, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1619, was determined to enforce Catholic conformity across the Bohemian territories and the broader Holy Roman Empire. His pressure on Bohemia's Protestant population triggered a revolt in 1618 that expanded into the most destructive conflict in early modern European history. The 30 Years' War consumed Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. Denmark intervened against the Habsburgs in 1625. Sweden entered in 1629 and achieved dramatic military successes before being checked. France, a Catholic kingdom, allied with the Protestant powers against the Habsburgs in 1635, prioritizing the containment of Habsburg power over religious solidarity. By the time the Treaty of Westphalia ended the conflict in 1648, millions of people had died from combat, from deliberate atrocity, from famine, and from the diseases that followed armies across the continent. The Habsburgs had achieved none of their stated objectives. The deep ambition beneath the religious rhetoric, transforming the loose ceremonial structure of the Holy Roman Empire into a centralized monarchy under Habsburg control, had been thwarted at every turn by the intervention of external powers unwilling to see it succeed. And then there was the other problem, the one that had been building quietly in the genealogical records for decades. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the House of Habsburg had been marrying each other since the family split in 1521. This was not unusual by the standards of European royal dynasties, which routinely used marriage to maintain political alliances and keep wealth and territory from dispersing. But the Habsburgs did it with a consistency and a narrowness that was unusual even by those standards. Philip III of Spain married his first cousin Margaret of Austria in 1599. Their daughter Maria Anna then married her own first cousin, Emperor Ferdinand III of the Austrian branch, her mother's nephew. Maria Anna's daughter, Mariana of Austria, then married Philip IV of Spain in 1649. Philip IV was Mariana's mother's brother. She was marrying her own uncle. Each generation compressed the genetic inheritance further, each marriage returning the family tree's branches back into the same limited stock. The consequences of this were becoming biologically unavoidable. They would become impossible to ignore in the person of a single child. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV and his niece Mariana, themselves the product of generations of first cousin and uncle-niece marriages within the same family. Modern genetic analysis has established that his inbreeding coefficient exceeded what would be expected from a child born to full siblings. The physical consequences were severe and numerous. The jaw misalignment that had appeared in milder form across several generations of Habsburgs, technically a condition called mandibular prognathism and now colloquially known as the Habsburg jaw, was so pronounced in Charles that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. He could not chew his food effectively. His tongue was reportedly so enlarged that he was difficult to understand when he spoke. He appears to have suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition involving the buildup of cerebrospinal fluid within the skull, and from episodes consistent with epilepsy. His cognitive development was severely limited. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. He was not expected to survive childhood. He became King of Spain in 1665, at the age of 3, because his father had died and there was no one else. He then proceeded, against all reasonable expectation, to survive for 38 years, ruling until 1700. He married twice, Marie-Louise of Orleans in 1679 and Mariana of Neuburg in 1690. Neither marriage produced children. Historians remain divided on the precise physiological reasons, but the outcome was unambiguous. The last Spanish Habsburg left no heir. The most powerful royal branch in the world, the dynasty that had ruled Spain and its global empire for nearly 2 centuries, ended not on a battlefield, not in a revolution, but in a single man who was the biological consequence of his own family's strategy. His death in 1700 produced immediate catastrophe. Europe went to war within months over who would inherit the Spanish throne. The candidates were Archduke Charles of Austria, representing the Habsburg claim through direct dynastic descent, and Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of the French king Louis XIV, through a prior marriage of a Spanish Habsburg princess to the French crown. Britain, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and Prussia sided with Austria. France had the support of Spain itself and several smaller powers. The War of the Spanish Succession consumed 12 years and enormous resources before the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 and 1714 produced a compromise. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain on the condition that the Spanish and French thrones could never be united under a single ruler. The Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg was gone. The Americas, the Philippines, the empire on which the sun had barely set, now belonged to a French royal house. The Austrian Habsburgs received compensation in the form of the Spanish Netherlands and territories in Italy, but they did not receive what they had fought for. The same year the War of the Spanish Succession ended, a new challenge was forming. Emperor Charles VI of Austria died in 1740 without a male heir. He had spent years negotiating an agreement called the Pragmatic Sanction, designed to allow his daughter Maria Theresa to succeed him. The moment he died, Prussia, Bavaria, France, and Saxony simultaneously contested it. The War of the Austrian Succession that followed from 1740 to 1748 introduced a new and formidable rival into the equation. The Kingdom of Prussia, led by its newly crowned monarch Frederick II, who seized the wealthy industrial province of Silesia and refused to relinquish it. The Habsburgs never got it back. Maria Theresa survived. She ruled until 1780 and proved to be among the most capable administrators the family had ever produced. She modernized the army, rationalized taxation, and introduced compulsory primary education across her domains. Her son Joseph II abolished serfdom in Habsburg lands in 1781, making the empire among the last in Europe to abandon a form of landholding that most of Western Europe had moved beyond centuries earlier. These were genuine reforms, but they were reforms conducted against a backdrop of continuous contraction. The Habsburgs participated in the partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793, and 1795, acquiring Galicia and its cities of Lviv and Krakow, which represented the last meaningful territorial gain the dynasty would ever make. The French Revolutionary Wars that began in 1792 brought a new kind of pressure. Austria led the initial European coalitions against revolutionary France and was defeated repeatedly. Napoleon Bonaparte occupied Vienna in 1805 and again in 1809. The Holy Roman Empire, which the Habsburgs had held for 350 years with only a brief interruption, was formally dissolved in 1806. Francis II had anticipated this, declaring himself Emperor of Austria in 1804, preserving the imperial title while stripping it of the institution that had given it meaning. The Habsburgs responded to Napoleon with the same instrument they had always used. In 1810, 18-year-old Marie-Louise of Habsburg married Napoleon, binding the dynasty that had conquered them to the dynasty they were attempting to survive. When Napoleon's invasion of Russia collapsed in 1812, the Habsburgs joined the coalition that dismantled his empire. Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich chaired the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815, restoring Habsburg prestige through diplomacy in a peace settlement they had not militarily earned. The 19th century was a slow, grinding process of reduction. The revolutions of 1848 swept across the empire, and Hungary came close to breaking away entirely, suppressed only through Russian military intervention. Emperor Franz Joseph ascended in 1848 and would reign until 1916, 68 years, the longest Habsburg reign in history. He presided over a continuous sequence of diminishment. Austria lost Lombardy in 1859. It was crushingly defeated by Prussia at the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866, in a campaign that lasted 7 weeks, ending any possibility of Habsburg leadership in the German world. Venice was lost the same year. The German Empire was proclaimed under Prussian leadership in 1871, and the Hohenzollerns, not the Habsburgs, unified the German-speaking world. The empire responded to this catalogue of losses by turning inward, making Hungary a co-equal partner in a dual monarchy in 1867, rebranding itself as Austria-Hungary in an attempt to hold together a state containing 11 major ethnic groups, speaking 12 languages, with no shared identity beyond the Habsburg crown. Vienna, in these final decades, was genuinely extraordinary as a cultural center. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis there. The secession art movement produced work that influenced the visual language of the entire 20th century. The waltz, Mahler, Klimt, a ferment of intellectual and artistic production that sat in strange contrast to the political paralysis surrounding it. The empire was industrializing rapidly, building railways, establishing automotive companies, becoming a recognizably modern economy. And it was simultaneously incapable of resolving the nationalist pressures that had been building for over a century. The Ottoman Empire, the same power that had accidentally gifted the Habsburgs 3 kingdoms in 1526, by killing the wrong king at Mohacs, was now itself collapsing. The Habsburgs absorbed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 as they attempted to fill the vacuum, and in doing so, absorbed a population of South Slavic nationalists who had no desire to be part of a Habsburg empire, and every desire to join the neighboring kingdom of Serbia. On the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the 83-year-old Franz Josef, was shot and killed in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Europe was already divided into 2 armed alliances. The legacy of the dual alliance of 1879 that had bound Austria-Hungary to the German Empire against Russian expansion. What followed over the next 5 weeks was the collapse of a diplomatic order that had been constructed to prevent exactly this outcome. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia, Germany honored its commitment to Austria, France and Britain honored their commitments to Russia. By August of 1914, the continent was at war. Franz Joseph died on the 21st of November 1916, having ruled for 68 years, and never having seen the end of a war his government had initiated. His great-nephew Karl I succeeded him as the last Habsburg emperor. By October of 1918, as the war entered its final weeks, the empire was simply dissolving. Czechoslovakia declared independence. Hungary separated. The southern Slavic territories moved toward what would become Yugoslavia. The Poles reconstituted their nation. On the 11th of November 1918, the armistice ended the fighting. 2 days later, Karl signed away his authority over Austria. A dynasty that had ruled the territory for 636 years ceased to govern it in the course of an afternoon. The Austrian Republic formally expelled the Habsburgs in 1919, ordering them to leave and not to return until they had renounced any claim to rule. Karl attempted 2 coups in Hungary from exile in Switzerland, both of which failed. He was transported by international agreement to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he developed severe pneumonia and died in 1922 at the age of 34. The Habsburg claim passed to his son Otto, who spent the Second World War in exile in the United States after the Nazis, whose annexation of Austria in 1938 he had publicly opposed, sentenced him to death in absentia. Otto formally renounced the Habsburg claim to Austria in 1961 and was permitted to return in 1966, 48 years after the family's flight. He became a member of the European Parliament and played a meaningful role in the expansion of the European Union through the late Cold War period, working toward a continental integration that 9 centuries of his ancestors had attempted and failed to achieve through marriage, war, and inheritance. Otto formally handed leadership of the House of Habsburg to his son Karl von Habsburg in 2007, 4 years before his own death. Karl served as a member of the European Parliament for Austria between 1996 and 1999 and continues to work with various international organizations. Habsburg Castle still stands in the Swiss canton of Aargau, roughly €10 to enter, a modest stone structure on a modest hill, the origin point of the most improbable dynasty in the history of the world. Think about the shape of what just happened. A family builds a castle in the Swiss Alps around the year 1025. They take the castle's name as their own. For 2 centuries, they are minor lords of no particular consequence. Then they start marrying well. They marry into Austria, into Burgundy, into Spain. They acquire Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia because the right king died at the right battle at the right moment. They acquire a global empire in the Americas because they happened to own Spain when Spain's explorers were conquering continents. At their peak in the mid-16th century, the sun did not set on their holdings. And then they turned the marriage strategy inward, wedding cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, branch to branch, for 200 years, until the strategy that built everything produced a man who could not chew his food and left no children, and the Spanish Empire passed to a different family name entirely. The Austrian branch survived another 2 centuries after that, contracting steadily, losing Germany, losing Italy, losing the coherence of an empire that contained 11 peoples who wanted 11 different futures, before a single assassination in a Balkan city unraveled the last threads holding it together. Were the Habsburgs a dynasty of extraordinary political genius, the greatest matrimonial strategists in history, the family that demonstrated for 9 centuries that a well-arranged wedding is worth more than 100 well-fought battles? Or were they simply the luckiest family in the right place at the right time, until their luck curdled into something genetic and grotesque and irreversible? The historical record, honestly examined, suggests the answer might be both of those things simultaneously, and that this is precisely what makes them so difficult to look away from. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.